Take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. And we've got another episode about folk tales and such. So, when we teach folk tales, we often treat them like containers. Open the story, extract the lesson, close the book. Be kind, be brave, don't lie. Message received, next story. But what if that's the least interesting thing a folk tale can do? Today, I want to talk about a different way of working with stories, one that moves past simple comprehension and turns students or children or whatever into active analysts, active listeners, not just listeners, but thinkers, comparers, pattern spotters. In other words, we're shifting from passive reception to narrativity, and we're going from lecture to analysis. Most traditional approaches rely on lecture. The teacher explains, the students absorb, the story becomes an example instead of an experience. This methodology flips that model, the methodology that I'm concerning myself with here today and presenting as sort of a better approach. Instead of asking what is the moral, we ask why does this story move the way it does? Instead of treating folk tales as cultural artifacts behind glass, we treat them as living systems, systems with rhythms, values, and assumptions built into their structure. The goal isn't to tell students what a story means, it's to help them see how meaning is made. And there is a three-stage core to my little argument here. At the center of this approach is a three-stage process that is immersion, deconstruction, and synthesis. Now, I'm sure I didn't invent these ideas. I did a little bit of research into some of the methods that are best recommended. And those are all simple words, but a potentially big shift. And let's walk through what they mean. So, immersion is like living inside the story. It's really the first step in this different process. And students don't read one folk tale and move on in the immersion idea here. They engage with several stories from the same cultural tradition. They listen for cadence, they notice repetition, they feel how problems arise and how they resolve. The stage isn't about an analysis just yet, it's just about absorption. You want students to start sensing things before they can even name them. Why do elders speak more than heroes in the story? Why does the forest feel alive? Why does cleverness matter more than strength? Questions like that. And there's a Rumi quote, at least I believe it's from Rumi, that fits perfectly here. He said, "But don't be satisfied with stories how things have gone with others. Unfold your own myth." End quote. Immersion gives students the raw material to do exactly that. Before they critique stories, they have to live inside them a little bit. And that's what deconstruction is all about, asking better questions. That's really the next step. And this is where comparison enters the room. Students are guided to dissect the stories using a shared framework. And, it's like you're examining their bones in a way. This is where archetypes matter. Most people know the hero's journey, the monomyth, call to adventure, trials, return, all of that stuff. But it's only one path through narrative space. There are other examples across cultures. We find many other examples. So, for example, the quest is a broader concept. A group pursues something of value, not always glory, sometimes knowledge, sometimes restoration. Think the Lord of the Rings or Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade, that sort of thing. The goal matters, but so does who travels together. Another one is overcoming the monster. That's another one of these archetypes. Here, the story centers on a threat, something that must be faced or destroyed. Think Beowulf, Jaws, King Kong. The question isn't who am I, but can this danger be stopped? And these are actually some of the best stories to introduce people to because they're relatively neutral. You don't have to have an overactive imagination necessarily because we can all relate to the immediate fear of fighting some sort of monster. Like King Kong isn't that abstract of a concept, even though yes, it is sort of an abstract concept still. But it's a large creature or whatever. So these are in some ways like I mean I'm just gonna say it. They're kind of the simpler stories in some ways, but that's one of the reasons they resonate with people, and you can still draw lessons from them, and you can still have a lot of different elements that you can examine in such a story. And there's also the rags to riches archetype. It's a transformation story like Cinderella, The Pursuit of Happiness, that movie. Even though I haven't seen that, I'm relatively aware of what it's about, The rags to riches story, these are stories that often map social mobility and personal growth onto a single life. And when students encounter folk tales through lenses like these, something interesting happens. They start asking better questions. Why does this culture favor a trickster instead of a warrior or king? Why does conflict resolve through communal harmony rather than individual victory? Why does success look like balance instead of conquest? That is narrativity in action. The story isn't just what happened, it's why the structure exists at all. I think that's a more interesting way of looking at stories, asking the deeper questions, making meaning. And that's really the final stage, synthesis. It's where students or just readers in general connect the dots. They compare traditions, they trace patterns, they notice how stories encode values, and then crucially, they turn the lens inward. What kinds of stories do we tell about success, about failure, about heroism? As one person put it on their Medium blog or whatever, they said they said that stories are the story we tell ourselves about ourselves to ourselves. And that's kind of what's happening here. If people look at the overarching nature of stories, I think they can really better understand themselves. Synthesis isn't about arriving at a single interpretation, it's about forming a personal, defensible one. Students aren't memorizing archetypes, they're using them. And this approach does more than teach literature, it builds analytical thinking, cultural literacy, narrative awareness. Students learn that stories are not neutral, they're shaped by history, environment, and belief. And once you see that in folk tales, you start seeing it everywhere in movies, in politics, in personal identity. And that's the real shift from consuming stories to understanding how they work and how they relate to the overall human story. So this methodology isn't about replacing joy with synthesis. It's about deepening the joy, really. You know, you're you're really grasping at some deeper connections if it's done right, of course. Stories stop being lessons delivered from the past, they become conversations across time. And when students unfold their own myths, they're not just learning folklore, they're learning how meaning is built.